Hello and welcome back. This is going to be the module 11, fire prevention through arson suppression. So we're going to get started here and get this show on road. There we go, it is. And one of these days, there you go, fire prevention through arson suppression. Overview of this chapter, demonstrate an understanding of the characteristics of fire and the need for a thorough fire investigation. List the most commonly accepted motives for arson. Remember, arson is a crime, and crimes usually have motives. Explain the model arson law. Identify and explain the 4 degrees of arson, and describe how the model arson law relates to a modern state penal code. Explain the importance of preserving evidence and the potential conflicts that may arise between fire suppression efforts and fire investigation. Explain the delicate relationship between fire investigation and the media. Explain how the court cases Mission v. Tyler, Michigan v. Clifford, Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, Inc., and the state of South Dakota v. Jorgensen relate to fire investigation. List some of the conclusions of NFPA's Arson Control Symposium with regard to arson control needs. Now, this is a picture of a basement. Looks like people that firefighters or investigators are rooting through a fire for any point of origin causes. Arson is the crime of maliciously and intentionally or recklessly starting a fire or causing an explosion. First arson law was in 1638, and it was pretty stiff sentences too back then. And it was death or having your hand chopped off or a branding iron on your head or something like that. It was pretty severe. 1818, they went away with death penalty. Weapon most often used is matches. That's a pretty anomaly with this crime. Most crimes, you take the weapon, try to decrease the availability of weapons, but well, arson's hard to do. Statistic arson rate per 100,000 total in the cities is 20.7. In suburban areas, it's only 12.8. So obviously, there's a lot more arsons going up in the cities than there are in suburban areas. The NFPA said in 2011, there are 26,500 arson structure fires, which was a decrease in 2010. Also, 14,000 vehicle arson fires, and that was an increase of 1.1% from 2010. By type of property, the percent cleared, in other words, they were good, prosecuted and all the way through, was 19.9%. Well, for community public buildings, the percent cleared was 36.2%. And the percent cleared of under 18 was 64.8%. So it's under 18, we're setting a lot of fires. We're getting caught a lot more often, obviously, because they're amateurs at it and leave a lot of trail, crime evidence trail. The model arson law was developed by the International Fire Marshals Association, and it's part of the laws of many, many states. And in it, they define 4 degrees of arson. First degree of arson, burning of a dwelling. It doesn't matter whether it's occupied or vacant. If it's a dwelling, in other words, it's a residential building, and it could be the accused or somebody else. And the penalty of 1 or 2 or 20 years. Now, why would you burn your own home down? Well, during an economic crisis, there were a lot of arson fires because people's homes were underwater. In other words, they owed more on them than they were worth, so they tried to set them on fire and get the insurance money. And that happens in an economic downturn. Second degree arson, burning buildings other than dwellings. So it could be a garage, it could be a warehouse, it could be a store, and it could be the property of the accused or somebody else. And the penalty is like 1 to 10 years for second degree arson. Third degree arson, burning a property owned by others that has a value of $25 or more. So it could be their car, it could be their golf clubs, who knows? 1 to 3 years. Well, golf clubs wouldn't burn too well, but the golf bag would. Anyhow, it's property of others. And fourth degree arson is just an attempt to burn. Willfully and maliciously set fire may be dischargeable, even if materials are only distributed, even if they don't start the fire itself. So it's a preliminary act of setting fires. And there's a separate offense category if it's done to defraud the insurer. Now, offender-based studies are examinations of the relationship between crime scene characteristics and the behavioral characteristics of the offender as they relate to motive. In other words, some of the crime scene characteristics may be leaving open gas valves, something like that. Motives for arson vary widely, but the most common ones are vandalism, just that for kicks, destroy something that they don't care about. Excitement, they want to see, have a lot of fun, see a good fire. Revenge, they don't like the person's building, I guess. Crime concealment. This is, I would say, somewhat common. They kill somebody with a gun, then they burn their house down. Figure, well, the cops will think they died in the fire and not know it was a murder. And that happens. Profit, again, what we just discussed, your house is worth less than it is you can sell it for, so you burn it down to try to collect the insurance. Extremist beliefs. Investigation of suspected arson. There's professional standards of care. NFP 921 is the guide for fire and explosion investigations. It's a standard that identifies guidelines and recommendations for processes and procedures to conduct investigations or analysis of fire and explosions. NFPA 1033, standards for professional qualifications of fire investigator. Corpus delicti literally means the body of the crime. In other words, it could be a real body, but also it could be the body of evidence that proves that the crime has in fact been committed. Prosecution must prove it wasn't set accidentally. In other words, they have to rule out every possible accidental source. Responsibilities of fire department, cause usually, but sometimes criminal investigation, cause only, and the police or third party could do the investigation. And sometimes it's joint police and fire teams that do the investigation. States vary widely. Some arson investigators have the power to arrest people and generally police powers, some don't. So all the states have their own ways of doing things. That's another picture of an investigator looking for trying to find out where the fire started. The source of the fire, that's pretty important in determining the cause. Insurance fraud requires an insurance claim. So if the claim is denied, then the insured person must sue because their claim was denied. And the courts can uphold denial, and they do sometimes. Of course, they also need a full inventory because a lot of times insurance claims are made on stuff that isn't even there. And one of the clues is changes in coverage. I just doubled my coverage on my house last week and it burned down this week. Oh, lucky me, huh? Yeah, chances are you're going to get looked at real close if that happens. The value of confessions could be a great assistance in prosecution of any case, not just arson, of course. And the confession alone can be used to convict the defendant, although generally speaking, they want some corroborating evidence, but it can be used. I mean, why not? They admitted it. Fire scene examination, scene security is important. So after the fire is still smoldering and before they start cleanup, it's the time when they have to call for an investigator. And then they have to secure the scene. You can't have press in there or anybody else because it's a crime scene. It could be a crime scene, it's a potential crime scene. Location of the origin is extremely important in any fire investigation to find out where it began. The possible source of ignition is important. Again, find out where it went. Firefighter rule. First on the scene, they have trained eyes, and they try to train them for a lot of things. Use of accelerant, and they also try to again look around for clues, tracks that could get in snow or mud, which could get obliterated by the fire suppressor crew coming in. Use of accelerant, the odor of it sometimes lingers. So the firefighter has a lot of rule in the investigation, especially if you're the first one on the scene. Now, this is really our fire cause and point of origin. This is simple to determine. That looks like it's pretty simple. Looks like a heater, I guess. Fire investigator has to be properly trained, of course, identifying evidence, tracks, fingerprints, containers like a gas can or something like that. People will leave it behind. Examination of the scene for unusual fire patterns, odors, fire patterns. They are somewhat predictable. So if there's something unusual, that maybe means something that was maybe started in two places. Fatal fires, and then again, an autopsy to be sure that this person wasn't shot and then the fire was burned to cover it up. So in every fatal fire, there should always be an autopsy. Preservation of evidence, site access control, and owners back in or reporters if it's a potential arson scene. Handling evidence has to be just like any criminal case. You have to be sure that the evidence is contained and where it was found at and when and who found it. You've seen it on TV a lot where they bag the evidence. That's how they do it. Spoliation of evidence. This is a term that I wasn't familiar with either. I thought they had misspelled spoliation, but no, it's spoliation of evidence. It's an intentional hiding, etc., of evidence. And then, of course, documentation of evidence with drawings, pictures, etc., photos. Control statements of the press is important because erroneous statements could jeopardize prosecution. If a firefighter comes up and says one thing, well, that could be used in prosecution later on to get the guy, get the person who did it maybe let off. And it should be a public information officers only giving control statements to the press. Arson, civil unrest, 1908 in Springfield, Illinois, 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1992, Los Angeles, California. And I happen to live in Los Angeles County, California in 1992. We lived across the, well, they call it a river, but it's basically a flood control channel of 605 from the most of the places. But the 92, that's what prompted me to buy my first 9mm pistol, because there were riots there. And I figured if they come across that bridge from across the 605 into where we lived, we were going to need to defend ourselves. And they never did. But that's why I first bought my first 9mm pistol, which I have beside my bed now, was because of that riot in Los Angeles. First time fire setters during civil unrest, arson and civil unrest. We've seen a lot of that last couple of years. And what do they like to do? They set fires. Why? Because they want to destroy stuff. And they're usually first time fire setters. First time fire setters generally leave a trail. Pretty easy to find out who they are, except in a case like this, because number one, it's hard to investigate the scene, and because of the mobs and the number of fires. There's also bomb threats going on, false alarms, luring firefighters to the other side of town intentionally. So guarding the scene to gather evidence is really difficult during arson and civil unrest. In 2011, they cleared 19.9% of arson arrests, and 32.7% of arsons cleared involved juvenile offenders. So juvenile offenders, so in other words, young people set a lot of arson fires. That makes a little bit of sense, right? Juvenile fire setters, they have a model program for them, which involves counseling, prevention projects to give them parental awareness. Sometimes the parents don't know what the kids are doing. I know my parents didn't know what I was doing all the time. And there's some court decisions, which we mentioned earlier briefly, and we're going to look at each one of these. Michigan versus Tyler established guidelines for right of entry. Now, to investigate cause and origin, gather evidence should the fire be determined incendiary. So the court held the original entry for suppression and subsequent investigation permissible without a warrant, but subsequent entries may require a warrant. So the first time that they're in the fire, right at when the fire is put out and still smoldering, you can go in there and get all the evidence you want. But after that, you may have to require a warrant. Michigan v. Clifford, court reaffirmed Michigan v. Tyler, but recognized the ability of the investigator to seize evidence in clear view of entry. In other words, when you walk in, whatever you see, whatever they recognize that the investigator has to be able to seize that evidence. State of South Dakota versus Jorgensen upheld use of evidence found during initial entry again, but upheld suppression of evidence found in later warrantless entries. So basically, what these decisions all say is that the original entry, original investigation is fine, pick up all the evidence you want, but after that, you probably should need to get a warrant to go in there, because remember, it's still somebody else's property, even though it's burned up. Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, Inc. allowed the court to gauge whether expert testimony aligns with the facts of the case as presented. As a result, Federal Rule 702 on testimony of expert witnesses was amended as follows. A witness who is qualified as an expert by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education may testify in the form of an opinion or otherwise if A, the expert's scientific, technical, or other specialized knowledge will help the trier of fact to understand the evidence or to determine a fact in issue. So what they're saying in this particular paragraph is that the expert's knowledge is trying to help the people that don't have that expert knowledge understand what the facts are in the case. B, the testimony is based on sufficient facts or data. The testimony is the product of reliable principles and methods, and the expert has reliably applied the principles and methods to the facts of the case. Arson-related research projects, serial arsonists. They usually have previous arrests. They wouldn't be serial arsonists, of course. They usually started setting fires at a very young age. They frequently have attempted suicide, and they frequently have been in a juvenile detention arena for more than once, usually. FIRE, acronym for Fire Investigation, Research, and Education, a facility funded by Congress that assists investigators in understanding and reconstructing the physical effects of fire in buildings. Sprinklers, smoke detectors, code enforcement are very important for arson. Sprinklers for any fire, not just arson, but sprinklers, because it'll keep it down, keep the fire down. Again, sprinklers were never intended to extinguish a fire, but they are intended to keep the fire and smoke down so it can be put out and to keep the firefighters safe. Improved investigator training and public awareness of arson as a problem too. They just don't understand about it. Summary of this chapter: the suppression of arson through the detection, investigation, and control of maliciously set fires has an important place in efforts directed toward prevention. Arson remains a serious problem and a significant cause of fires in the United States. Many communities need a coordinated effort between police and fire agencies to investigate suspicious fires and to bring about prosecution of arsonists. A further need is more qualified fire investigators in the field and thorough training in investigative techniques to discover and preserve evidence of arson that will hold up in a court. The crime of arson often goes unrecognized because of the lack of thorough investigation or because of failure to develop sufficient information to determine that arson has occurred. So I'm sure there's a lot of fires that are arson that are never considered to be arson. The model arson law, developed by the International Fire Marshals Association and adopted in the law of many states, defines 4 degrees of arson with corresponding penalties. The phrase willfully and maliciously is the key factor in these provisions. To obtain a conviction for arson, the prosecuting attorney must be able to prove in court the fire was, in fact, willfully and maliciously perpetrated. Some states have adopted the model penal code of the American Law Institute, which differs in some respects from the model arson law. It is helpful to the prosecution of a case if a motive can be established. Motives for arson range from insurance fraud, revenge, and cover-up of another crime to satisfaction of the abnormal urges of the vanity fire setter and the pathological fire setter. A valid approach to the suppression of arson is a thorough investigation of all fires, and that's not a bad idea. No longer can the fire officer just assume that a fire is accidental just because the location or the owner is well known in the community. Because motive for a deliberately set fire may not be readily apparent, no presumptions can safely be made. In other words, it's hard sometimes to figure out why a person would have set this fire. A systematic examination of the fire scene is all important in establishing the origin of a fire, whether it's accidental or not. The fire service personnel who arrive first should observe general conditions, the people and the vehicles in the vicinity, the presence of distinctive odors, the intensity and travel speed of the blaze, all of which can be clues for the investigation. If arson is suspected, a fire investigator is usually called to the scene. A trained investigator looks for any traces of incendiary origin of the fire, such as use of flammable liquid or accelerants, and evidence of tampering with equipment, such as gas valves left open on heating equipment or stove burners turned on. Photographs may also be taken at the scene, probably should be. All evidence should be delineated in the fire investigator's report, and all physical evidence should be carefully preserved for laboratory examination and possible use in criminal court proceedings. That'll be no different from any other investigation of a crime. Arson is especially prevalent during periods of civil and economic unrest. Difficulties in investigation, collection, and preservation of evidence are compounded in fire that occur during these periods because of multiple fire calls, false alarms, confusion, and mob intervention at the scene. Statistics of the FBI Uniform Crime Reports show arson and malicious burning as a major crime problems in the country, and figures prepared by the NFPA show that losses from incendiary and suspicious fires have increased. This is a serious matter for the fire preventionist. The only way to combat it is to persist in efforts to expose and suppress the crime of arson. Fire suppression through arson suppression, fire prevention through arson suppression is the chapter, and we're done with that. So one more thing I wanted to, in any of the quizzes you see, if the question asks you, what is the ABC? You could say it's the American Bully Congress. That's not the answer. The answer is American Bully Congress, the organization that sets rules, etc. for bullying. Now, if they ask you what is the acronym ABC, then the answer American Bullying Congress is just fine. So make sure when you answer the question, you answer it completely. If the question asks you what is something, then you have to give me what the acronym means and what that thing is. If it asks you what the acronym is, then all you have to do is give me what the acronym stands for. The acronym is just the initials. So, all right, that's it for this time. Be safe, everybody.